If you build a successful game, does it mean that the next one will be successful too? Every indie studio dreams of making their second game bigger and better than the first. More features, bigger team, higher production values. DigiTales did exactly that with Between Horizons. Their first game, Lacuna, launched at the height of COVID 2021. Noir detective aesthetics, clear marketability, solid success. Their second game, Between Horizons, launched in 2024 into a flooded market with a sci-fi team that didn't scream detective game and a scope that ballooned beyond what their niche could support. I spoke to Julian, founder of DigiTales, to understand what went wrong and, more importantly, what he would do different. You've gone yourself through lots of learnings with DigiTales. You shipped 2 titles, Lacuna, which was quite successful, and then last year Between Horizons. You've been very open about what's worked and what didn't. I read your postmortem and I found it very admirable how honest it was. So thank you for that. You candidly shared there about production mistakes, about scope creep, the challenges of scaling a small team. So I'd love to dig into these lessons and get a bit of practical advice that other studios can then use in whatever context. And maybe to start with, can you share a bit more about the difference of production methods between Lacuna and Between Horizons? What were like the fundamental production differences between these 2 projects?
So Between Horizons was kind of different insofar that our studio was already up and running when the project started. Lacuna, we began basically in our free time before DigiTales was founded. I was already working in the industry, but I was freelancing and doing other stuff. I started out with game audio. So it had a long pre-production period where it could just basically develop on its own until the point where we already had a vertical slice, had the story and everything planned out, and could pitch it to publishers. Whereas Between Horizons, and this is kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, you have to kind of develop the next pitch as you are working on your current project, right? Because if you wait until your current game comes out, you're going to fall into a hole, especially money-wise. It's going to take a while for that money to start coming in, right? So you have to dedicate some resources during the first production to developing the pitch and getting it to a point where you could present it to investors, to publishers of your next game. So this was unique about Between Horizons. We kind of had to squeeze it in the middle of this already stressful 1-year production of Lacuna. Luckily, we only had to pitch it to our publisher, Assemble Entertainment, who was already publishing Lacuna and was happy to work with us again. So we were in a very privileged position to be able to just not have to pitch it to 200 different publishers. But still, that was a major difference. Lacuna was able to develop over the course of 5 years before we even founded the studio. Whereas Between Horizons had to be sort of created on the fly in between production milestones for our ongoing Lacuna development.
Did that pressure that you had then for Between Horizons, did it influence production decisions or how you define scope?
I think we could have taken more time to think about things if we hadn't had all the pressure and the timeline of our current project that we were developing, because at the end of the day we had monthly milestones for Lacuna, and for Between Horizons we were just trying to set some time aside to develop a pitch somehow in between those. And maybe we would have thought harder and made some more wise decisions if we had just a year or multiple years to slowly develop this in the concept or pre-production stage, rather than having to do it on the fly in parallel.
What were some of those things? Can you share?
I think that the way we scaled it wasn't wise, because we kind of fixed things that weren't broken, and although the thoughts that we had and the game design decisions that we made, they were cool and they were in service of the genre and the core experience. So we didn't just start making rookie mistakes like saying, oh, why don't we add RPG elements to our detective game or something like that. So it was all in service of this detective experience and it made sense. But the additions that we did make were not fully thought through, in the sense that they increased the scope, the budget, the required manpower in ways that we wouldn't have needed to. We could have honed in on an experience that would have been maybe more similar to the one in Lacuna and maybe more focused on the core of detective gameplay, I think we could have made some decisions of changing up the formula in ways that wouldn't have required for us to increase the team size and the money we need to make the game. And I think that would have been wise.
You mentioned, I know, that Between Horizons is a quality game but harder to market, especially in comparison to Lacuna.
Mm-hmm.
When did you realize this, and what do you think could have been done maybe differently in pre-production that would have kind of helped with this?
We should have asked ourselves this question of marketability in pre-production in the first place, because we really didn't. We did, of course, think like, will this be a nice game to play for the detective audience? And it is, but the problem is we didn't really ask how it will reach that audience. And of course, we always thought about, like, does it look good? Does it sound good? Does it, like, you can, when you see the trailer and everything, you can feel that it's a quality game. But the problem was that we didn't think about the marketability when we decided on the title. We didn't think about it when we decided on the key artwork. And we basically realized this very late. Even though the reception was kind of lukewarm from the reveal trailer onwards, we only really realized this after the release, where we were like, everybody who plays this game, or like not everybody, but a lot of people playing the game and reviewing it later on would say, I came here because I like Lacuna and I follow the developer. So we were like, okay, our audience knows that we make detective game, but we are barely getting new people on board who know that we offer a detective experience. So almost no, over a year after release, we added a subtitle, a sci-fi detective adventure. And we changed the artwork to something that looked a little more mysterious and like investigating, because neither the artwork nor the title ever said this about the games, like what you do in the game.
Lacuna, on the other hand, performed really well. Like, what did you do there differently that kind of reached this audience or that made a difference?
There were multiple things. One of them was just the lucky timing where Lacuna came out at the height of COVID and Between Horizons came out with the deluge of games that were funded during COVID when the industry was booming, right? So I think there was a better market in 2021 when everybody was just stuck inside playing video games. And in 2024, kind of the opposite was the case. The pendulum was like swinging back all the way on the other side in that moment. So I think it was some factors are just outside of our control. Also the factor of our publisher. We felt they were doing more to promote Lacuna. We were on like big live streams. They sent out merch to streamers and everything. And for Between Horizons, they didn't do any of those things. So they marketed the game less for whatever reason, and we are not really in control of that either. But in terms of our own input, Lacuna was made with marketability in mind, but more or less on accident, because we didn't really think of marketability when we came up with the concept. It just happened to be more marketable because you know that a noir game might provide detective elements, especially when the protagonist is this smoking, hat wearing, trench coat wearing, brooding noir like stereotype, right? So we had an easier time communicating the detective experience with the theme, whereas Between Horizons is much more like pure sci-fi, and that doesn't exactly scream detective.
What's your approach in general of setting scope? I mean, the first game was more, you started yourself. It took a lot longer time. So I guess you had more time to just figure things out on the go and make mistakes and just take your time. And the
Yes.
second one, you were under pressure. And also, both games overlapped at the same time. So I guess that also required adjusting scope and figuring out how to do two projects in parallel. So what's your method? Like, how do you set scope in these kind of different phases of planning?
So to like people who are new in game development, you usually like hear the advice, you like make the smallest game, right? Scope as small as possible. It's like the first thing you hear when you come into the scene. They're always like, you make it smaller and then half that. And I would say that is not wrong, but I think you should make the smallest game that you actually want to make, because like if I had to make Pong in 3 days, I would lose interest after the first, right? And Lacuna was kind of the smallest game that I knew I could somehow make with some people. So I wouldn't say make the smallest game, but the scope, you always underestimate what it turns out being. Because for Lacuna, we basically had some ideas that like, you always have a feeling about those ideas that they might be up on the chopping block first. And it's okay to include them in the beginning of the phase, but mark them as optional in your mind to begin with. And then you start deleting them throughout the production from last to most important, right? And the core ideas that we had, they were basically like the must-haves. They were basically built around some pillars or like mantras that we had. Like for both our games, we had the design pillar, no getting stuck, meaning you can never not continue because you don't know the solution. And this way we would, somehow always drive the story forward, even if players just submit their best guess and make mistakes with every case. The story will go on and there will be like repercussions later. So we had some of these guiding lines, guiding principles, and to keep the scope in check, we basically had to I like to always be very concrete about what something means down to the technical, because oftentimes you have a lofty idea like that, no getting stuck, right? But you have to really, really early on understand what that really means if you can, and try to like think through the implications. And the other thing that we always do is test, not always, but that we do now is test ideas in a very simple way early on. We did this sometimes with some of our ideas to even decide if they're worth implementing. I mean, we have some idea of like how long it takes to implement something and how much time and man hours will go into something. And when we try the scope, we always try to also be within a budget range where our projects can feasibly break even within at least like a few months after release, and not just for ourselves, but also because we want to pitch them to investors who have this requirement. So I would say anything that goes beyond the scope where you already think, okay, this is gonna like break even after a year or 2 year with the tiny niche that we're in, you're just gonna have to scrap it. There's like a very clear boundary to how much you can do. For example, with detective games, in my opinion, where you're like, this is part of it and this is clearly not. And the audience also won't care about this. Maybe it's unique, but like nobody who plays detective games wants to have, I don't know, like quick reaction challenges or whatever. It's like you have to really understand what's part of the core and what isn't. And those things that aren't part of the core, it's okay to have them, to have like a standout thing, but they usually, you have to be ready to kill them at a moment's notice. And you usually kill them one by one throughout production. And then you're happy that you ended up with the MVP at the end of it.
Curious about that part. How do you actually structure a backlog or a planning process to actively kill speculative features before they eat up development? I assume, because I've spoken also to other game devs, like building a game is not just like building a standard company. You invest kind of emotion into it, so you're fairly attached to it, and there is like things that you also are maybe passionate about. So how do you decide, okay, what are the things that actually make sense to keep, what are the things that are going to move the needle, and what are the things that we just need to scrap to make sure that we abide by deadlines, abide by kind of what actually users want?
I think that you shouldn't be emotionally attached. And I really think, I mean, it's easier said than done, but usually it only hurts like just until you actually cut it off. And then you're super happy and you're super relieved that you don't have to do this thing anymore. And we should have done that sooner. Like one of the things that we wanted to do in Between Horizons. And this is not just coming from nowhere. There was a reasoning behind it, but we always considered it optional, was that traversal should maybe be more fun because you run around a lot. And people say this about the game, right? You backtrack, it's kind of open worldish. So you have to run around a lot, talk to people. And games with a lot of backtracking, they usually have things that make it more fun. They keep you busy. They vary it, right? You can swim, you can climb, or even like just keep your fingers busy, like in Hollow Knight, where you have a bunch of backtracking. There are all these little things you can slash in the environment just to click a button, right? And it's just better than just holding left. So we were like, okay, are there ways we can improve this? Can you like sometimes balance over, so at least like that your character automatically plays another animation to keep it a little more varied, right? And then this was one of the ideas that I really would have loved to implement, and that I think would have added something to the game, because traversal is a part of the experience for better or for worse. It's not like it would have even been an addition, would have just made something that's there more fun. But about halfway through, it was absolutely clear that we would barely hit our goal of finishing the game, like the core game, in the time frame. And I don't have a system for cutting this type of thing, but what I do have is a very like a compulsion to go back to the drawing board like at least once a month and looking if we're actually on track and checking if this is actually possible, not just our current sprint, but the whole thing.
I wanted to talk to you a bit about deadlines. So
Yes.
you mentioned that setting deadlines and figuring out how much time it's needed for certain things came sort of with experience. The more you did it, the more you knew how much time it's needed to develop certain thing or to ship certain thing. But how did you deal with it at the beginning? Like, what advice can you give, especially with like people who are starting out or studios who are starting out, who are figuring out how to set proper scope and proper deadlines in order to reach kind of the time frame?
You know, you sometimes hear this advice of double your best estimate, right? It's like whatever you think it takes is going to be twice as much. And I mean, that's probably not wrong. If you want to figure it out on the fly as you start out, track your time, I guess, just use time tracking tools to see how long stuff takes and try to extrapolate things from that. You always, especially with coding, there will be new issues all the time, and you have to just allow for a huge buffer. It's hard to quantify, but a bug could be very severe but very easy to fix. But it could also look like a minor thing and take you a week to figure out. And this is even as you are fixing it, you're not going to know until you're done. So I don't think there's really perfect advice there, except like plan for much more than you'd think you'll take. And yeah, at the end of the day, adjust it on the fly. If you have people to like communicate to, like a publisher who sets deadlines or something, just like be open and honest and tell them early on that you're not on track. Even you don't have to tell them the night off or the day after that you didn't hit the deadline. I would say if there's already some plan, be honest with yourself and your team and with the investors or publishers about it, and you will always adjust it on the fly. The first plan will always be wrong, and this is normal. You have to be flexible and have some, like, I would say if you're going to budget for it and if you're going to pitch it with a budget and a timeline in mind, that should already reflect a good amount of buffer. Like if you think you're going to take half a year to finish the game, and that's kind of nothing in game development terms. Like half a year is over immediately. Budget and pitch with like a year, or I would say, because you're going to be stuck like maybe with the cost later on. Publishers might not be willing to, extend budgets or time frames without renegotiating like the shares of the contract and stuff like that. So I would say be super duper cautious, overestimate everything within a range where you think your project isn't getting too expensive.
How do you deal with kind of managing a team and in terms of setting scope and reevaluating if the effort is successful? Do you have specific metrics that you track, or do you have specific overall objectives that you then, I don't know, weekly, bi-weekly track?
So we have used in Codex both milestones and runs, and usually I try to see that the effort points are equally distributed if the time frames are equally distributed. So I have people what amount of effort something takes, what their best guess is, and then I try to, if I can already see on this milestone that we've been piling stuff up on because we didn't get it finished, there's like 180 effort points for this person, then I set them up for failure immediately. So that has to be reshuffled, and not just on the day of the deadline. Like I said, I check in very often, and if I see something like this, I'm like, okay, this entire chunk, this entire feature, this cannot be on the same milestone as this thing, because and then it moves the whole timeline backwards. I would very frequently reevaluate this type of thing. And unfortunately, planning for it is just, it's almost more naive to plan for it than not to plan for it, because you can't. You just have to allow yourself the flexibility in the first place that we're not going to run out of money the day we think the project will be finished with our first estimate.
Yeah, you always need to put some buffer, hopefully.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about Codex, what made you decide to use Codex?
I was on board with Codex years ago, like pretty early on. I don't remember actually how I got to Codex, how I heard about it. I mean, I've known the guys behind it for a bit, probably that way. But the reason I stuck with Codex is that I just think it's extremely powerful and super fun. I really think before, at the very beginning, we used Trello, which is more like, I don't know, for like maybe big picture stuff, but it doesn't have the features you really need. And then I've also used Notion, which is kind of nice for documentation, but not for project management at all. It doesn't like, it's terrible, honestly, because even simple things like displaying like subtasks in a timeline view doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And the Notion like official reply oftentimes is, well, just code it yourself. You have Notion, you can just do that. And I'm like, no, I want that to be a feature, please. It's very basic. And Codex just does everything I could think of. It probably does more than I ever use because it's almost overkill. But everything I've ever wanted to see, dependencies and all that stuff is there. And it's very reactive, like dev team behind it. And I've seen people just like report stuff, vote on stuff, and that stuff gets done. And that's really nice. It feels like this, and this shouldn't change if Codex ever like grows or something. Like it doesn't become a juggernaut, please, like Atlassian or whatever, where you just shout into the void. With Codex, you're just on the Discord server and you whine about something, and it will eventually be addressed. So that was also a big plus for me. And now there's almost nothing for me left to complain.
Can you walk us through your Codex setup?
Yeah, sure. So we have a lot of like, for each game that we have a project set up. And I really like that you can just toggle whole projects on and off. So you can really see the milestones and everything and the workloads for exactly the projects you want to see right now, everywhere, even in your calendar and everything. So that's really cool. And then sometimes we have areas inside these projects set up where we have like a pre-production and a production, for example. And in those areas, we have decks that we call a pre-pro code, pre-pro art, and then, production, co-production. And we started out with milestones because at the time there were only milestones. And now we organize stuff mostly through runs, as long as we are in an ongoing production phase, because it's more easy to, with this like very, very regular like time frames, you can have an easier time gauging if this is feasible. Like, what did we manage to do the last 2 weeks? Usually we do 2-week runs and we like do like a weekly to catch up about it. But we're a very small team, so we talk all the time and we'll figure out pretty quickly if a run is actually feasible or not. And yeah, for myself, I also use due dates a lot with like, deadlines for applications and stuff like that. It's super good to have a separate reminder, because you have something in a run, you might get around it last, and then, oh shit, this was due Thursday. At the very beginning of a project, I try to structure it very roughly, knowing that especially later on, we're going to have so many cards that we don't know of yet, because there will just be new things. So you have to have a lot of empty effort points the further out the runs are.
How do you structure your decks? I'm very curious. What do you divide them by?
So you mean like from deck to deck or within a deck?
From deck to deck,
Mm-hmm.
but then also within a deck, that would be also cool.
That depends on the project. Like in a full-on running production, we have art, tech art, code, UI, game design, content, which is mostly like writing and implementing content, audio, and overhead. Those are like, I would say, the ones. You can put tech art into code or into art, but we like to have a separate deck because we outsource all that. So I have a clear idea, okay, this deck is not gonna put workload on our internal team. And then within a deck, sometimes we have, you can sort it in a million ways, but we sometimes have a manual order. And this also kind of changes throughout the production. Sometimes we can use this manual ordering for things like, okay, must-haves and nice to haves or something like this, like, the areas within the deck. Game that's out now for Between Horizons, we have patches on, and we had patches planned. One of them came out not so long ago. For example, we sometimes put, like, in addition to putting them in the actual milestone, we have like an area for like, oh, this could be cool for the 1-year anniversary. So we put everything in the code deck that we've been wanting to patch or fix or whatever into an area that's called 1-year anniversary. And we might not make all of it for that patch, but then I have a easy overview what's left over, and I'll move it, for example, into the 2-year anniversary area. And we usually start out within such an area with the highest priority, and then we cut everything off when the deadline looms, that is like lower priority, and we move it to the next one.
I wonder also, this is something that you wrote as well. How much focus do you actually put on documentation, and how do you make sure that you invest enough time into project management, especially kind of setting everything as it should be, but also kind of not getting sucked into the void of planning with no end?
Yeah, I don't know. It's both documentation and management, like kind of two separate questions for me. Documentation, I think have very different and strong opinions about that. My experience has been that it's kind of nice to have people just document stuff on the fly and just like leave a comment above a method and be like, this method does that. Or especially like if there's like an obtuse line and you're like, this does that, just for the future, especially with systems that interact with a lot of other stuff that might break in the future or might have to be extended in the future. But sometimes when it's like a one-off thing and you're like, it's not super complicated, it's not worth scheduling extra time to document it because it'll just be doing its thing and nobody will touch it again. But it's always hard to actually know if that'll happen, right? So it's tricky. At the beginning, we had like dedicated documentation days where we were like, okay, on Friday, I don't remember, like every other week or something, we actually write stuff down. But that would kind of not often meet our needs because if you did something last week Tuesday and you have to write down how it works 10 days later, it's kind of artificial. Just do it now if you think it's important. We have a wiki and we have a documentation that can actually be generated from our code base. We just did it on the fly. But oftentimes it was unnecessary, and in some instances, we should have better done it. But if somebody's religiously being like, no, we need to have this super clean, nobody will care. Like, no player will ever like your game better because its documentation is so well written. But then you had to scrap 2 features because you were busy fucking documenting, right? And on the other hand, if you have programmers doing obtuse stuff and never even commenting on their own code, good luck when something breaks, and good luck if they ever leave the company, right? So has to be a smart middle ground. And in terms of management, it's kind of the same way. I try not to micromanage people too much. So I think one way to do this is to ask how long will this take, and then just take them by their word and kind of tell them what they said rather than me telling them. So like, you said this was going to be done Friday. So where is it? Right. And why is it not working? And how much longer do you actually take? And blah, blah, blah. You can have that conversation. But I think some people like excessively check in on people and some people are too hands off. Also a difficult line to walk. At the end of the day, I do see myself spending just time fiddling with Codex sometimes because it's kind of satisfying. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, it doesn't need to be this elaborate. Like you could just be doing the task, or the person could just be doing the task. You just had a meeting about it, right? So yeah, just checking in with people frequently and making adjustments on the fly, I think is the key.
If you could go back to the start of Between Horizons production with what you know now, what's the single biggest thing you'd change in how you manage the project?
I wouldn't scope it in such a way that it requires expanding the team and scope and budget. You can scope it differently, you can make changes that make sense, but I would be very careful about the ones that make the budget and team size just balloon because it has implications that are not great. Like for me personally, I spent too much time with overhead when all the creative work was done by other people, and when that was actually what I was signed up for in the first place. And you have to kind of be honest about yourself, about what type of market you can reach and how much your game can feasibly cost to be worth it in that niche. So I think our biggest problem was not that we changed things, but that we changed things in such a way that made it bigger and more expensive when it didn't need to be.
For studios working, especially on like narrative heavy games, but also in general, what's the one production practice you think you could recommend that would maybe save them the most pain?
Try to have a pipeline where the writing and game design are actually set in stone and final before other people start making assets for that. So, if we have a new case that we design, we test it with people and see if they get the hang of it and if it's fun and if it's the right difficulty and all that. And we make adjustments to that as long as need be before we give it to artists to make assets for it, right? In Between Horizons, we kind of were strapped for time because we were running late with everything and we were just hoping that the cases would work. And they did end up working for the most part. But I think right now in our new production, we are much more careful about wasting resources or potentially wasting resources this way. So have your game designers and writers do their thing and then test it with people before you even like set up a Unity scene, unless you need that for testing. And then we actually only create assets that we need. Like I think for our new game, we created like 1 or 2 sprites that we might not need. But yeah, like a good workflow where writing and game design work ahead of the other departments, and you have playtesters on the ready all the time to verify if your ideas actually work. That has proven very valuable for us. I think if, like maybe that's a takeaway of its own, that you have to kind of do it for a while and develop a gut feeling and see the warning signs as you go. And the best thing you can do before you go into a production is make sure you're in a context where stuff doesn't immediately go south if it's not according to plan, because it won't be according to plan. And you have to be fast to react to that and open to communicate that. That's my main advice, rather than how to make the perfect plan, because you can't.
Yeah, that's definitely been something that has been mentioned before, because it's anyways like what works for one studio might not necessarily work for another.
Yeah.
And you can kind of try and extract as much know-how and as much just like learnings, but there is no secret sauce. If there was, like, people would have been doing successful games one after the other.
Exactly.
And like producing a game is so hard that at the end of the day, you need a bit of luck as well, I guess.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's people making those games, and people in every studio are different. So I can't really tell you how to deal with your programmers and your artists and whatever, because it's super individual. I will say that, like, you should trust your gut, like especially if the producer or project manager is somebody who also does development and has some idea, or like is also the same person who is trying to be the vision keeper, right? I think I should have stepped in earlier with some things, because individual parts of your team will always have their own idea of what makes the game good. And the artists will think the best art will make the game good, and the game designers will think the most fun game design will make the game good, and the coders will think the best code will make the same design will make the game good. And that is the least true. Like, the good code has never won an award anywhere. And I feel like sometimes you should just be like, as the even though you don't know as much about programming or about art, you should just try to rein in the perfectionism of these departments and be like, this is good enough for players. Nobody will leave a review saying this particular pixel bothered me, or I don't like how this and that class wasn't documented perfectly, right? But there is this saying, to a nail, everything looks like a hammer, right? And I feel, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's the one. And everybody in your team is sort of a tool of their own that has a very specific vision. And you oftentimes have to just go like, no, it's fine. It's good enough. Stop. We're doing the next thing. Just to wrap it up here. That's like the one universal thing that I've been doing this 11 years in my own and other studios, and that's like something that I could tell every team. Like, there will always be a struggle about, like, whose interest. And I think managing these interests and managing these expectations as somebody who's trying to get the project across the finish line is your main thing. And you have to understand that they're very different from one another.
And I assume that there is then the challenge of like deciding, okay, which of those things actually matter and which don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, but at the end of the day, if it's like, in my mind, everything is kind of a slave to game design, or should be. Even though we make story-driven games, the game design is kind of what should dictate most of the other stuff. In that the ugliest games with good game design have some of the biggest fan bases. Visuals can be nice to reel people in, right? But if it doesn't serve the core of the game, I would say that's the thing you can be less perfectionist about. And the core of the game is usually the gameplay, and that's dictated by the game design. So in my mind, game design decisions kind of trump everything else.
Do you then tend to gather user feedback in parallel, just so you can understand whether it resonates before you make the next decision and the next decision?
All the time, yeah. Yeah, we send our stuff to to like players on our Discord and to friends. And once it's public, we've also just like made calls for playtesting on Reddit and stuff. So we get some strangers in who don't have to be nice to us. And so yeah, just do that all the time, I would say, to make sure you are not wrong about what the core actually is, and you're not wrong about what the fun actually is, because you might have the wrong idea.
Going on Reddit is definitely very brave.
It was good. It was good. It worked out for us. We still, some of the people from Reddit are now on our Discord and are part of our playtesting community. There is this anecdote from like Monty Python movie. I don't know if it's actually true, but they were reshooting this scene because somebody on set was insisting that the fog didn't look right. And one of the actors was just getting frustrated with having to redo the scene and just said, "But is the fog funny?" And I think that is such a good point. That's like what you have to ask yourself, right? Like, is the fog actually funny? Are people gonna leave the cinema and say, like, that was such a fucking hilarious comedy, but the fog in that one scene, like, just didn't look right, you know? So somebody on set might be the person who is in charge of the fog, and they will have you do the scene 10 times. But then, somebody has to step in and be like, we're not making a fog movie. We're making a comedy, and it has to be funny. And I think with games, it has to be fun. It has to work. It has to be immersive, engaging, whatever games can be. And however you achieve that, that is the main goal. And if the art isn't perfect, if the sound design isn't perfect, it's all secondary.
That makes a lot of sense. I didn't know this anecdote. I do love Monty Python though.
Because we know it in our studio, I sometimes say, is the fog funny? When I try to make this point, like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for the player experience. Anything that isn't player facing can be just be held together by duct tape and a prayer. I feel like it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if players don't see it. Doesn't matter. There are so many anecdotes from legendary games. Like, I think the trains in Half-Life are just hats of NPCs, or was it in Fallout? They just move around, but they didn't have a way to move the trains, but they had a way to move non-player characters. So they made the train a hat and had non-player characters just walk around under the train tracks to make these trains. This is the hackiest thing ever, but nobody ever knew before this was like leaked as a fun fact. And nobody said, I hated the game because the trains were hacky.
No, I mean, it's also absurd to me sometimes to see the type of games that tend to outperform. I mean, just going on Roblox, I spent a bit of time there because I was working at a company kind of building also a game builder. And what kids like 8-year-olds absurdly love to play.
Yeah.
It just looks crappy and it's laggy but they love it.
Yeah, it's crazy. Roblox games are an enigma to me, honestly. Like the scary grammar game or collect your Italian brain rot stuff. I don't know, like, people, they don't care. Like, if it's topical and it's fun, like you see this recent development of friend slop, right? That is, of course, lends itself to like viral moments and streamers, that has a bunch of advantages. But this is like it being unpolished is almost part of the selling points, right? Because it's like funny when the characters ragdoll around and stuff, and it's just if the core is good, the rest around it can be super unpolished. We've seen this also with horror games, because people kind of like indie horror games, and they're often short experiences, and there's a big fan base. A lot of people play a lot of small horror games, and these are oftentimes, they have like the default UI from whatever engine was used, because nobody ever leaves a review saying this was scary, but the UI was like the default Unreal UI. So I don't like nobody cares. Nobody cares. You can cut so many corners, and you have to know which corners to cut.
Makes sense. Thank you so much, Julian. This was a lot of fun.
Sure. Awesome. Thank you very much.